Hello and welcome to Energy Voice Out Loud, where as always we are leading the global energy conversation, but this time we're at the Energy Exports Conference right here in Aberdeen. And joining me on our sofa today is Sam Long, CEO of Decom Mission. Feels like I haven't seen you in a wee while. How are you doing, Sam?
That's a fair comment, Ryan. Probably haven't seen you in a while. I'm good, thank you. We, like everybody here, I think we're busy kind of finding that mixture of what's going on now, what's going to be happening in the future, and signposting between the two is probably still a bit awkward.
Yeah, well, let's maybe touch on that a little bit. You know, I'm going to hit you with the heavy questions up top, and we'll speak a little bit about, you know, obviously operators and decom firms kind of go hand in hand. They both need each other, right? And right now we're seeing with the operator community a bit of a struggle on signing off on projects and sort of making sort of big moves because we're seeing political instability, specifically here in the UK. But I think quite a few countries are looking to go to elections this year. I think I heard on the show floor it's a record number of elections across the globe. So when it comes to that, you know, that sort of lack of surety from operators, how's that impacting, you know, your member firms?
You could argue that it's been a perennial issue forever, right? That when the organisation was established, there was this piece around decom's got to happen, but we don't know how it's going to be executed, and so the idea was let's establish a body that can bring buy side and sell side together. The truth is, it remains one of the biggest challenges we have. There are different legislations in different parts of the world that drive decommissioning in different ways. So in the UK, we're not time bound. There isn't a signal that says you have to get this done by a certain time. And so that lack of legislative driver means there can be an implied lack of market transparency in terms of activity that's coming around the corner. In fairness to the operating community, they've got to decide where to spend that capital, they've got to prioritize it. Does it go into the energy transition? Does it go into new barrels? Or does it go into a decommissioning of an old asset? So I don't blame them. It's a complicated space. For the supply chain, it does create uncertainty and challenges. Underneath that all, the UKCS just gets older by the day, and every day it gets older. That decommissioning job just gets slightly harder. And so there is an increasing technical need to get on with it.
And that's quite interesting. Let's sort of touch on that that lack of signalling from operators, and that idea that they can't really say what they're doing. You know, there's a lot of things up in the air right now, and it's fiscal or, you know, political. So how is that impacting sort of P&A firms or, you know, other sort of engineering firms that are associated with Decom? Because surely that plays into their 4 or 5 year forecast, right?
I think you're very politely asking me, is everybody going to hang around in the UK, or are they going to disappear off to another market?
That was the angle. I was trying to be a bit subtle, which isn't like me.
So subtleties aside, let's be brutally honest. The time-bound nature of legislation in Australia in particular means assets have to be done within a time span. The regulator is forcing their hand and saying to the large operators, that asset is now offline, it has to be removed within this time period. And there's very similar happens in the Gulf of Mexico. It creates a very transparent market that can be laid out in an ABC style. So the UK lacks that. So the UK has much of the technical expertise, but doesn't have this ABC layout of work. I don't blame my members and others for going chasing international work. It's inevitable. We still get this rather awkward trade-off of activity that has to be done in the UKCS. Everybody knows it has to be done. But in the meantime, do you know what? I might take my capital and my ability and go chase an international market. And we've been actively telling our members to do that. It feels the right thing to do. That doesn't necessarily mean it makes the position in the UK comfortable. There's a risk that we have a liability that doesn't get executed in the ideal fashion. So the trade-off for the operating community is they want this done on a low-cost model, but other markets are hot, and so capability is going elsewhere.
And so what let's spell it in black and white then. If we're getting subtlety out the window, let's spell it in black and white. What does that actually mean in the UK? You know, isn't it, that we're at the Energy Exports Conference, you know, we're speaking about exports being a good thing and it helps firms, and, you know, but is there a risk then that, you know, your likes of, say, Well-Safe Solutions, they've moved to Australia, you've mentioned that, they've opened a base down there, they're still Aberdeen based, but is there a risk that, well, the grass is greener over there, let's just jump ship, or is that the concern that you're highlighting?
I think if you are the regulator, and remember that the taxpayer is paying 50% of the bill, roughly speaking, then there is a job on behalf of the taxpayer to say, man, we need a competitive market here in the UK to get this work done. And so there are discussions that are held about how do we make sure we try and keep that competitive. But at the end of the day, it's, oil field services, in being specific, has become almost unfashionable at the moment. But the truth is, oil and gas plays, greenfield and brownfield in the Middle East and other markets are also very hot. So that's also drawing capability. I think in your question, you yourself have reflected it. There are service providers who want to stay here in their hearts. It's their home. It's what they've done. They've built competence and capability here. They're facing awkward choices about how much capability do they now put overseas. There will always be, the thing about that, decommissioning is it's almost an inevitable legacy. Somebody's going to have to do it eventually. And so we often feel that there will be a niche series of providers who will be there, who will survive and will be capable of doing it. But many of them are going to be drawn into the energy transition space eventually.
And so let's maybe cycle back to the start at the top of this conversation then, maybe sort of contextualize what's causing this. We spoke about political and fiscal instability, but is it just a case that the grass is greener over, over the fence, overseas? Is that the case?
Put crudely, yeah. I mean, you can make a return in an Australian market because you know that you'll be doing a project for Chevron or a project for Exxon, and it will be happening in 1 year, 2 years, 7 years. Now, the informed seller in the UK, despite that opacity of the market, they still know what's going on. We do have, let's not underplay the UK market. It is the most mature basin. Our assets are right on their technical limit, and we have produced most of the barrels. So there is a latent domestic demand for that capability to stay here. There are technical challenges that are highly exportable. So it feels the same thing. I want to spend my capital in the UK and build capability here, but I will go to that market where it's transparent. If I do my research work and I network like these events, I can know what I need to do in the UK. It's probably just the pace in the UK is not what people would desire from the supply chain side.
And is that something that, right now, this week, we're seeing, obviously we're in a build-up to a general election, we're seeing, day recording, Lib Dems put out their manifesto yesterday. We're seeing Conservatives and Labour are coming up, same with SNP. Is that something that you're sort of looking at for policy to maybe say that same idea as, Australia, you need to, from cessation of production, you need to have decom work started within a certain time frame? Is that going to help?
We talk of that as a shift to time-bound legislation. Should we have time-bound regs that say Ryan should remove this asset by 2 years' time? The problem is it'll take you 10 years to get an act of parliament through, and then enact it into legislation. And in the meantime, we might well have liquidated a bunch of work, or we may not have anyhow. So there is an argument that says we should, and as an independent voice, and then as an independent trade association, I think it's important that we say these things into the community. We are willing to have that discussion around maybe it should be time-bound. But remember, there are other macro factors going on in the background. For instance, there's a continuing discussion about comparative assessment that's being addressed at the moment within the OSPAR parties. We are one voice at OSPAR, we're not the only one. And that is a multi-billion-dollar decision. And so I have to recognize the complexity in what we're trying to take on here. I can't sit here and say, man, OSPAR's wrong, we should just push against it. It is not that straightforward. It is far, far more complicated. And then ultimately, you and I are UK taxpayers. So any of these changes in legislation could have an impact on our tax bill. So as a specialist in decom, I'm very conscious of the intricacies of it all, and it's all interconnected. The politics, I would quite happily speak to any of the political parties and try and explain to them, decommissioning is part of decarbonisation. If we don't deal with the energy infrastructure legacies of the 20th century, we're really not going to build the 21st century systems very sensibly. In the renewables community, we're slowly gaining traction about a realistic discussion. You cannot build renewables without thinking about how the hell does it come out in the future? What is the materiality of that? Where's that steel going to go? What's going to happen to those raw earth minerals? There will not be enough. You're going to have a more circular economy. And so we're just trying to raise awareness that it's not just about past industry legacy, it's also about future legacy.
And is that maybe something that oil and gas maybe missed out on when, obviously, the UK is sort of, like you said, it's an older basin. We've been operating for quite some time now, but Is that an oversight that we didn't regulate right from the start? That sort of decom projects, we didn't have decom regs from the start that we maybe should be looking to with offshore wind?
So in fairness, we did. And we said the license holder will remove structures. What we didn't really know was what would be the capability 40 years to remove structures or not remove them. So we do have legislation. It would be false to say there isn't. The renewables community in offshore and onshore, their licensing program does include decommissioning. As independents, we're not sure they're being wholly realistic in their calculations and their estimations. Within the wind community, they have to renew their decom program quite regularly and submit it back to DESNZ in the UK. We think that there are learnings to be had from oil and gas and how you handle mature assets. Is it too late for oil and gas? There's a risk that it is in the UKCS, but there's an awful lot of oil and gas around the rest of the world that's also got to go through a transition. So we remain, I challenge myself to say the cutting edge. We remain on the leading edge of decom and what it looks like, and plenty of other basins are really interested in that. May I also remind you, nuclear decommissioning in the UK is worth even more money than oil and gas decommissioning. So it's not just about, all the attention tends to go in oil and gas. The reality is even nuclear is struggling with this issue at the moment.
So a lot of challenges facing the decom market, but there's a lot to be gained, right? A lot of work on the table. So, well, thank you very much, Sam, for agreeing to join us here on the floor at Energy Exports Conference. And thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to stay a part of that global energy conversation, stay tuned to Energy Voice Out Loud.